Okay, so we're
Thank
seeing
you. Sorry to
information.
interrupt. We are now
We're seeing
recording.
information. We're seeing information about the Software Improvement Group, which is a company. Thank you. Right.
Yep. Okay, thanks. So one thing I didn't mention yet in the introduction is that when we are developing these methods, we believe in using data and benchmarking for that, because with a lot of things like, every system has duplication, for example, on the code quality front, yet you want to minimize duplication. Everyone will occasionally discover vulnerabilities and you want to fix them as quickly as possible with what is the definition of quickly. So it's very hard to set an absolute boundary there, that what should it be, 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 second. But their benchmarking is quite helpful to tell people what is an acceptable, like resolution time. So we've been building that benchmark over the past 20 years. So these are 7,000 commercial projects. So of course, we also are in the open source community. We get to that in a second. But in terms of commercial software, we think that we are one of the biggest, if not the biggest benchmark that's out there. So we kind of like showing this around also because it builds some credibility with us. What you see in this chart is that volume is from left to right. So we calculate code volume in person years, both because it's more intuitive to non-technical people, but also because, if you have different technologies, like 100 lines of code in one technology is not 100 lines in the other. Some languages are more verbose. So we normalize in that way. And from top to bottom is how we benchmark code quality. So of course, like this is for code quality, we want to build similar pictures also for more security and privacy oriented metrics. We'll get to that in a second. But in this kind of picture, this is very nice to communicate to people because quality is an abstract concept of where they stand in the market. And if people are in the lower right quadrant of this picture, usually you see them kind of like jumping to the edge of their seat because they start to get nervous a bit. So to some extent, this is fear mongering, but it is actually quite effective in communicating like that the issues are urgent. You can like write the word urgent, but this data focused approach, it helps a bit better to kind of get people to take it more seriously of what the state is. So that brings us to the project we're doing today. So Ayun already introduced it. So we are currently working on a security maturity model for open source communities. And yes, we are aware that there are many of those, but there are some angles here. So the thing is that if you look at kind of traditional certifications, they assume that a project is owned by a single entity. Like also as we do in this code quality benchmark that we just showed. But of course, a lot of open source projects are either a pure open source project that is exclusively owned by the community, or it's a hybrid project that you have volunteers, but there's also a corporate sponsor there. Nevertheless, you want to measure the security maturity of that community. So not necessarily of what they have written down, but how the process is functioning in reality. And of course, you cannot like benchmark completely different projects with each other in this regard. So you need to have a subset. So we are doing this on open source Linux distribution communities. So we have a benchmark there that includes currently, I believe, 5 distributions and sometimes multiple versions from each distribution, because also we want to measure this over time. So in the end, security is a dynamic process. So that means that also like you will have a rating on a certain time period. So in terms of the differences with existing standards and maturity models, maybe you want to elaborate on that, Hayun?
So if we look at the current standard, for example, like BCM OpenSUM, they are most cases, let's say, more process oriented. And also it's what we are looking for is trying to look actually not even focus that much on process, but we look at the facts. We look at, for example, the let's say the vulnerability patching speed, and we look at some security settings, and especially for the Linux distribution, there are like a security configuration, etc. So we also look at the current model, or let's say the tool that your group is working on. So that's also more like a similar like our approach. But a little bit different, I think Dennis later will show some slides, is we're also looking at like a time period. So not only just at this moment, what is the security in the code, but we also look at a set of practice, like how the code review is done, how the security patching is done, etc. So maybe Dennis, I think once you show the next slides, could be more clear to everyone.
There's a question in this chat. Is the intent to measure Linux distributions or well-known and used projects? So do you mean like projects in general, like open source projects in general, or do you mean open source projects for Linux distributions?
Yeah.
Dennis, you have a false equivalency if you're trying to say that a Linux distribution like Red Hat Enterprise Linux is going to have more maturity than a small 2-person project that happens to get embedded in 50,000 other places. So is your intent to look at distributions like a Debian, SUSE, Red Hat, Fedora type stuff, or are you looking at projects like a kernel, Kubernetes, glibc, that type of stuff?
In this particular project, distributions. So it's indeed OpenSUSE in there, Ubuntu, Debian, but so it's not only measuring the code, but it's also looking at their processes. So how fast do they actually patch the vulnerabilities?
Okay, so your target. Let me repeat that. So your target is, measuring Debian, measuring Red Hat Enterprise Linux, measuring Ubuntu. You're measuring an open source Linux distro specifically.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can mention something is our current focus is on the Linux distribution, but on the other hand, our model is more generic. So we are also looking forward for the next step to, let's say, also focus can be any open source communities. So we are not limiting ourselves, let's say.
Yeah, so you have to start somewhere. So to say that it applies to every open source project on Earth, that's a bit grandiose. So you need to select your domain where to start. And then later on, we also get to find out like if the characteristics of different type of projects are comparable. And I honestly wouldn't know if the security process for Kubernetes is comparable to the one for Ubuntu. We would have to find out after this current phase. Marta asked, do you look at the distro-related code only or also on the dependencies? That's a good question, also on the dependencies. And this turned out to be a logistical nightmare because, of course, there are the dependencies in the way that, like the upstream project, but many Linux distributions still work with package maintainers. So you have like people that draw patches from upstream that put their own patches on top of that. And in many cases, the link to the upstream community is not explicit. So it exists, but it's not necessarily you can find in a file. And there are also a lot. Like I believe the smallest one in our benchmark had something like 8,000 packages, and the largest one like Ubuntu had like 30 or 50,000. So the amount of data science was slightly more ambitious than we had anticipated in the beginning. But we also believe that this is actually a thing, because I wonder how this will evolve in terms of security processes, because you get conflicts between upstream security fixes that need to be incorporated in the distribution itself. And the workflow that most of the distributions use, it takes at least a couple of weeks before the upstream patches are in. And if you look at application software development, that's a bit more kind of dynamic nowadays with the security processes. So we wonder how this is going to work. David, this is not new news for okay. That's we of course as users we know a bit on how these open source projects work, but of course Linux distributions, they're still a bit special in that regard. So it's we thought there's some packages with can it be a couple of hundred, but we slightly underestimated that. Jacques says that you might want to talk to Active State. They have full dependency resolutions. That's a good one. Let me write that down.
By the way, probably later, Christopher and David can share this video also with us. The recording.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I think Chrome's making the recording, right?
Yeah, there is the record. So I think all these comments will also be recorded. So. But then is for your information, I'm also writing down something, so you can
okay, that's good.
with your recording.
Yeah.
Okay, then maybe to make this a bit more concrete, we can move to the actual model. So this looks a bit intimidating. So our code quality model has 9 metrics because we want to keep it lightweight. But the thing is, you first need to have something that's very comprehensive before you can narrow it down to the true most important metrics. So as Ayun already mentioned, this spans a lot. So if you look at the project organization, there's on the left, you have more process related KPIs. So like, for example, do they do code reviews? And again, this is not only if they write down that they do code reviews, but whether they actually do it. And there's evidence that they have done so. And these middle 2 bars are about the dependency management process. So in a Linux distribution, this is all about packages. So usually for an application, it would be more about libraries and transitive libraries. But so you have this whole unique angle here about packages and about when do they patch and when do they fix it upstream. And it's fairly unique to Linux distributions. So also you have the whole vulnerability management process. So how quickly do they patch it? Do they release timely information to their users that a vulnerability exists? And on the right, we have more the distribution contents. So do they ship with security features included? So this is very, very wide. What we do see is that these middle 2 columns, I believe that they draw the most interest from people so far, because it's more about their day-to-day process. And of course, also for them, it's a nightmare to manage these 10,000 upstream communities. Okay, then of course, like it's nice to count these things, but at some point you need to quantify it in a way that's comparable. So maybe how you want to take this one?
Yeah, so basically what we are doing is from the left to right is the process, how we, let's say, measure. The left part is what Dennis just showed. So that's the, let's say, the KPIs that we measure or we define that what are considered as the good security best practices. And after that, then we define the concrete measure, and ideally that all the measure could be measured automatically. But from our current case, I think like 70% are completely automated. The other parts are still some manual check. And after that, the third one is the aggregation. So basically, because it depends on what the items we are measuring, some items that it might like, let's say a patch, let's say patch speed, for example, then you could do like an enormous amount of patch within a certain amount of time. In those cases that all these several thousands data points, we need to find a way to aggregate to come up, let's say, a rating that are more comparable with each other. And after that, then we have the benchmark to look at the different communities. So that's also the idea there is if there is one community you would like to see, okay, what is my weak points? They could via this benchmark results to see, okay, what are the compared with the other industry, let's say comparables, what are their weak points, strong points, so that they can identify what are the most important things to improve. So basically that's the, let's say, 5 steps. Dennis, I believe you also have some concrete examples regarding the benchmark KPI and the aggregation.
Yeah, so we have one that's relatively simple, then it gets more complicated.
So for example, this is one example, like in the beginning, we have this, this is particular with, let's say, Linux distribution, the kernel security. And we look at, for example, this OpenSSH security and hardening. And in this particular case, we look at several, let's say, main configurations or what is their setting, etc. And based on that, we use some tools to figure these numbers out and to consider, okay, what are considered as a good configuration, what are considered as the bad configuration. So this is one example, rather straightforward, let's say. And there are the 5 projects, as we just mentioned. We didn't give the name there. It's also one reason of that is also because our current results, we still are working on all the validation and etc. So for that purpose, we didn't put on which one is, let's say, Ubuntu, which one is Debian open source. But on the other hand, of course, they are, let's say, public. They are just open source information.
So how are you accounting for communities that might be putting together a general use operating system that is not intended for hardening and security versus a commercial offering that might have some hardening options, but still needs to give their customers that flexibility versus a truly hardened, secure offering?
Yes, that's a very valid question. So for that purpose, we actually also put this as, let's say, basically just open, how we measure, what we measure, and how we evaluate. But it's completely true. So for example, like there were also several cases like different levels of which one it is let's say applicable for this community or which version, etc. But we would like to give a, let's say, generic recommendation. So for security, this is the best. Of course, the let's say the community, when they restrict their measurement, because it's transparent, they can also make their let's say explicit decision. Okay, this we will accept this and we will keep like that. So that's we are open, I think.
Because there used to be distributions like Scientific Linux that in that use case, they need performance or certain open flexibility that a commercial entity and enterprise does not,
correct,
would not be acceptable there.
Correct, yeah. We actually, for other measurement, we have also similar cases, like for different distributions. Some distributions, they always choose to fix the patch immediately, and some long support distribution, they prefer to do this more, let's say, stable. So those are the kind of different strategy. So our idea is we define this model and we give the recommendations, and also we give the community some recommendation, like what is your purpose and what is strategy, and what we recommend them to follow some, let's say, best practices.
It's also in general, these software quality metrics, we try to make them context free. So also with code quality, if you have a mainframe that's 30 years old, then of course you wouldn't score 5 stars, but it doesn't mean that we need to adapt the skill, because then it becomes very hard to understand what does that number mean. So the number is always the same. And, you know, if you, on the application level, if you do internet banking, you would expect you to score 5 stars on security related metrics. But if you make your internal, you know, that powers the lunch menu, then you would not have that same target score. So it's also the measurement always means the same thing, but where you kind of put your own target, it depends on the context and what you're trying to achieve. There was a question like, could you do the same thing for the BSDs? Yes, but of course, to make these models, there's also some community expertise required, because of course, the eventual number that comes out is context free, but to design it, you definitely do need the context. So we would need to revisit this and check how do these processes work in the BSD world. And we would also need to have some experts that know more about that in order to validate some assumptions that we have. Okay, so this was a relatively simple example. We also have, maybe I can do this one, Ayun. So we have here, this is something where you count this per upstream community. So if you include a package in your distribution and that upstream community dies out, it will eventually be a security risk for you. So then you have the choice to either no longer include that package or take over the upstream maintenance, but at least you might need to do something in the long term. But of course, as established, every distribution includes thousands of packages. So you have more than one data point per project. You will always have a couple of outdated packages in there. So what we do is, this is what Hayun talked about earlier. We have this risk profile. So we assign a category for each project. So these thresholds, they are themselves based on a benchmark. We try to use some numbers that are slightly rounded to make them intuitive. And then you can prioritize, okay, how many truly problematic upstream projects do we have, because they're red, so they have 0 commits in a year. That's probably an issue. We need to take action. In these orange ones, we see that the projects are slowly starting to die out, so we can take them into account. You have a question, sorry, or comment.
So a recent version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux in the full install included 9,000 packages, and I'm assuming the other distributions are similar. So how are you, out of those 9,000 potential packages, what's your criteria that somebody gets a naughty score versus they're clean and green? Because not all 9,000 of those packages are going to potentially adhere to your, they might be feature complete potentially.
True, but 0 commits is a bit suspicious because eventually you run out of people that still have knowledge on the code. Because even if the maintainers are still around, they might no longer have up-to-date knowledge. So that the like 0 commits, we call it red. So 1 to 10 commits in a year is also not really a lot. So you can, so this is, and it's also a risk metric, right? It doesn't mean you must take action.
Out of those 9,000 packages, how do you give a grade to the overall distribution? What's the threshold there? How many red dependency packages need to be? What's the qualification for grading the distribution there?
Right, so that's where these benchmarking comes into play. So like hypothetically, if one of them would have 70% red, then we say, okay, well, you have too much because all these other guys have way less. So we, but Hayun is probably the better statistician. So maybe you can explain the process.
Yeah, so of course, for our current research projects, so for example, this example, we only have like 7 samples, which is in generically speaking, is not sufficient data points to do the benchmark. But normally how we do benchmark is we look at this kind of risk profile. And for example, like a SAG, when we do benchmark, we have like thousands of projects data in it. And we look at this percentage. So based on, for example, this red, orange, yellow, green, so they are considered as from the very high risk to the low risk. And we look at this distribution, we look at the whole, let's say, thousands of projects, and we look at, for example, the best, let's say, 20% or worse 20%. Based on those, we give certain criteria. That's how we normally do. Yes.
What is risk in your eyes?
Yeah, so in this case, in this particular example, so the risk we consider as the high risk when there is this package that there is 0 commit during the last year. This is
so what is the risk that could be realized because something hasn't been updated in a while?
Yeah.
The package is unmaintained. So if an issue occurs, then the risk is that there's nobody there to fix it for you. So you need to do it yourself or it doesn't get fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah, although it's not a Linux package, I often like to point out the isodd package in JavaScript, which is very, very widely used. And the only reason it needs to change is when the language itself changes, which is practically never, because oddness is a fundamental property that doesn't change. So I'm actually, I think for larger packages, noticing no commits is somewhat suspicious, but saying it's a risk is there's a concern unless there's a way to suppress the many false positives you're going to get from that information.
That there's something on the rating level and something on the finding level. So on the rating level, this approach is robust against false positives because it's not forbidden to have red, right? Like every project will have some red in this chart. The only thing you want is that it's not out of control. So in that way, these ratings are robust against that. The thing is that if people want to improve the ratings, then they indeed get to the finding level. And then they will yell at you if the top 10 is not useful to them. So that's something that we on the kind of like reporting level, we have a storyline there. But indeed, for the findings, we need to have some way of weighing that against like the most useful findings up front. And so that there's also this Java XML library, JDOM, and I believe they haven't had a release in 6 years. So indeed, that showed up. Not here, but in an application. And indeed, some libraries are pretty much done, but others, if they are not showing any activity, there are also quite some cases where there is really an issue because there are still issues, there are still open pull requests, but just the maintainer doesn't have time anymore. So that happened.
I'm sorry, I must go. Thank you for your opportunity, though. And please take care.
Will do. Thank you for attending.
Yes.
I believe we have our third and final example, and this is the one I believe that most people are interested in, at least from the people from these distributions we showed it to. So you want to take this one, Hayun?
Yes, so this one is about vulnerability patch speed. So in these cases, we look at how vulnerabilities are patched within different days. Actually, I have to say a bit that this picture is not the latest version we have.
I have that afterwards, actually. I start intentionally with the simple version, and then we can have the more complicated one.
Yeah. So basically, we look at for different CVEs with different CVSS scores. So they normally considered as, let's say, high severity CVEs or low severity CVEs. And in those cases, we give a risk, let's say, profile based on, okay, for a certain CVSS score CVEs, how long time take for the team to patch. And based on that, we also like a similar story like the previous slides. So for different patch, we give them either as a high risk or low risk. And high risk are normally the case the time to patch. So those are the how we do these things. And then if we look at this graph, then you can already see that the 7 different projects, there are a little bit of the different behavior from how community patch their CVEs. So then if you show the next table, I think that's become a concrete. Yeah. So for example, the current way we took is like this. So based on the CVSS score, and if it's above 9, so which is let's say a very high priority severity ones, and it's normally that we need to patch, for example, like within 1 day. Otherwise, if it takes longer, then consider already as moderate or high or very high risks. So this is how we treat those. If it's a CVSS score that less than 4, so then in those cases, we do allow the team to take longer time to patch. Also, maybe one thing we can mention here is we also, during our research, we also noticed because currently we use these CVE published dates from the NVD. So, but we also noticed, for example, like different community, let's say Red Hat, they could already have certain CVE findings and then patch first, and then they finally officially publish to the NVD. So at this moment, we are taking the NVD publication dates as the dates.
Yeah, so meaning you can have negative days in this thing, because if you fix it before it's in the NVD, then we count it as patched in minus 34 days or something.
Yeah.
Are you looking at NVD or the MITRE CVE database? There is a lag from when it goes into MITRE than when it gets transferred over to CVD or the NVD.
Yeah, true. So we had some discussions about that because that's there was also some security people that got angry at us for even suggesting that the NVD was a reliable and fast source of truth. But it's objective, so that they do lag behind, but because we allow negative days, we believe that we are somewhat covered by that. And it's at least it's something that everyone universally considers as a respectable source. So it prevents some discussions there. But we noticed that I forgot the exact percentage, but it's like in some distributions, it's like 30 or 40% of vulnerabilities are fixed before they are published to the NVD. So that has a significant impact there.
Yeah, from my memory, is Ubuntu. Ubuntu has especially Ubuntu has a stronger case like that. We also actually look at, for example, there was this CVE in the database. We can also find out when this CVE ID is reserved. So that's could be as a very good indicator. But on the other hand, they also clearly mentioned that when they reserve the CVE, then in principle, that's kind of the leave them time to do the investigation, which can also turns out to be not a real vulnerability. And also, because we would like to do this more, let's say, equal or let's say fair to all the different community. And for certain dates, for example, Ubuntu or I say OpenSUSE, they might already know, okay, this CV exists, but for other communities, they might not know. So then it's not fair to say, hey, you patch it later because of that reason. So for that reason, we choose at this moment the NVD publication dates.
How are you accounting for the difference that a commercial entity has a release schedule versus an upstream community that potentially has more flexibility in their releases? And the fact that maybe something's released asynchronously and then is officially built into the distribution a month later as part of a minor release.
So this relates a bit to Yotam's question. So where are you getting this information from, if I paraphrase you? So we are parsing the security advisory data. So when the distribution says we fixed it, that's the date that we use. So that doesn't mean we only take the major versions. We take their kind of, and that's why we need to, this is a rolling process, right? So this particular chart that we made in the previous slides, this one that was based on the year of 2021. But if you would make a new one based on January 2022, you would get different values because this is this dynamic process we talked about. So we do not scan the kind of like the images that they provide or the live systems. We actually did do that in the beginning, but parsing the security advisories is a bit more practical for us. And we do make the assumptions that people speak the truth in those advisories, but for these communities, that is the case, fortunately. Marta asked, do you count the issues the distribution does not fix? Yes, but not in this metric. So it becomes a bit difficult to have these composite metrics that look at multiple things. So this is one that's on the vulnerability patching process, but there's another metric that I believe it's called vulnerability risk profile. That's about the open ones. Regarding the terminology, the risk, indeed, that risk is a probability of a negative event and the potential negative impact of that event. True, so it's like with impact and likelihoods. We are indeed creative with calling this risk profile. That's valid. Also, some people from the risk management corner has some comment on our terminology. We might need to change it. So the quality profile, that would also work.
You're doing a qualitative assessment, and that is less persuasive than a quantitative assessment. And you never can tell a business what their risk is. It's up to that business to determine their risk appetite.
That's a valid comment. So like risk is usually you need more on the business context level and not necessarily on the technical finding level. You could call it severity, but it's also not entirely accurate. So we would need to think on how to call this thing.
Yeah, so a little bit background. This is also the term that SAG with our quality model often use. So that's probably because of that. Dennis and me, we just use the same term as granted, let's say.
But it's like we occasionally do hear this comment. So it's not at a frequency that we think, oh no, we need to change it immediately. But it's something dodgy that was decided 20 years ago, and we haven't gone around to fixing that.
Yeah.
And how are you accounting for exploitability? The majority of like low severity findings are never exploited. So how does that factor into your assessment? In
this metric, I believe we do not. Because there you would have to have an objective way of evaluating the exploitability, and that's not something that all these distributions do.
I think Jacques had a question.
Yes, I had two, and one of them I've already forgotten. More of a speech and reply. I noticed that some of the metrics seem to be about the product, and some of the metrics seem to be about the project. And I feel kind of like uncertain about mixing those together. So I belong to the sort of the Hubbard / Jones and Freund school of assessing security risk, which is that we should use probabilities and not matrices. I realize that that's hard, and like there's nobody's like sat down and done the multiple regression yet to give us the formula. But I still prefer that framing. Anyway, the point I brought up about those two different things is that, like, I feel like if you were able to build a causal model of security into which you could plug some numbers and get out a prediction, I feel as though you would probably separate product and project from each other. So project would be like my prediction that a new vulnerability will be introduced sometime in the future and how often that will happen. And for product, I'd be saying something like, this is deployed. What is the probability that it gets exploited? How many times per year do I expect to have a successful attack against this product? And you can see that those are kind of different things, and I'm wary of mixing them. I know that wasn't a question, sorry.
No, but you can see me writing along, so that means it's a valid comment. So you're definitely correct. I think that our initial focus with this project was more on the former from your explanation. So it's like so how does the project ensure that as few vulnerabilities as possible are introduced? So rather than on the product security, which is ironically where SRG is kind of coming from. But you're right that in the actual model, we kind of blurred the lines a bit, included both dimensions. We may or may not separate it into two different sub-ratings or just have two separate models. So I definitely see where you're coming from, but I don't have an immediate answer or reply, to be honest.
Yeah, so another thing is maybe it's good to also mention what is the goal of our research, let's say, because the idea is we hear open source communities saying that they feel they are doing the good things on security, but they are not very certain. So they would like to see, based on the facts, of course, these facts can come from the product itself, can come from the process data from that, and then to look at to identify if there is some security best practices that they might not follow well enough. So that's actually that's of course then come to this kind of a little bit mix of different KPIs, because if we really think of our projects, it's not really to predict or consider, okay, what is the, let's say, this product will be exploited from the security aspects. Of course, this could be very important thing, but it's on the other hand, it's not really our goal to look at that. Our goal is by looking at those KPIs to find out if we can see some best practices that might be followed well enough. So that's a bit explanation, let's say. I think Jacques has a...
Yeah, meet me again. So I think the angle I'm coming from is working in one of the working groups, Securing Critical Projects, where one of the outputs we're trying to develop is a ranking of projects in order of risk, where risk is like the frequency that bad thing happens times the magnitude that bad thing happens. And that's where I'm interested in process metrics more, because I see those as, project metrics or process metrics. I see those as leading indicators of future trouble. And those are ones where we as the OpenSSF can intervene more effectively to encourage people to adopt new processes and so on. I'm not sure I'm making a particularly sharp point here, so I'm going to stop rambling.
But I think that's also the reason we are now sitting together to discuss this, because we have our angle, you have your angle, and we can explore. That's also what we would like to do, is to see if there is any way that we can, let's say, collaborate, and there are something that we can, let's say, borrow from each other, or we do something together to explore more. So that's we are completely open. Yeah, definitely.
There's a comment, so that's about what we would like to get from you. So it's like, of course, brutally honest feedback, so which is working out pretty well so far. So the thing is that, so people that work on these projects, the way that they look at it is they want to be the best in these graphs. and if they are not the best, they want to know what are the things, what are these red things, you know, give them as a list and then we can fix it, which is true, but it's not exactly fundamental criticism on the model itself. And I think that these process projects kind of like questions, they really touch the roots of what we're doing here. So where to put the scope, because of course you start out with a focus and at some point people ask, can you add this, can you add that? And then it kind of blurs a bit. So I think this is very helpful. And also that what you just mentioned, Jacques, about kind of what you're working on. So maybe also other people want to share, like, does this relate to anything they're working on? And like, if so, like, could you elaborate a bit on how you see this kind of thing? Like, how do you get people to have this information, but in an actionable way?
So there were also Christopher asked in the last few minutes, what would SAG like to hear about? Yeah, so we see that you have these projects, and also I see that if I understand correctly, this tooling is measured weekly, automated.
The scorecard, you mean, or
The scorecards?
Yeah.
Yeah, is
Okay.
Mr. Scovetta still on the call?
I'm here. Yeah, scorecards are fully automated, although it's not my team, but yeah, it's fully automated, and that was a central tenet of the project itself, was to make it so that there was no nothing manual. The best practices badge. The best practices badge is a combination of automated and manual. I think it's mostly manual. I do
There's
like
an interview process David goes through.
like a
so yeah.
questionnaire
Yeah.
So I think from my perspective on I think both alpha and omega, having better tooling, like if I could plug in an arbitrary project, you know, Kubernetes or glib or whatever, and see more interesting facts than, let's say, scorecard provides, because scorecard is very repo based. So having more in the process in an automated way, that would be huge. I don't know that I'm always wary of and I've been burned by this multiple times. Like, once you assign this is good and this is not good, then like almost nobody is happy, because the people that you said were good probably aren't, and other people point that out, and people that say you're bad are like, well, you just don't know my thing. Having just like sticking to the facts, like this here, is pretty objective. The colors though say, well, because you haven't patched, you know, in 180 days, you know, you're worse, you have higher risk than something else. For me, the facts provide 90% of the value, I think.
I will say my one comment is I still have a boggle with how you are combining the different groups of upstream projects, cohesive communities, and then like commercial entities. They all have very different capabilities, resources, and goals, and you're kind of combining that as one thing. So you should be very prescriptive in, we are grading, for example, commercial distributions, because those are people that get paid to support these things and they can be held accountable. Whereas an upstream project doesn't really care about your score necessarily. That's not part of their goal. Their goal is to deliver delightful software that solves a problem. And but you know, a well-formed, mature community might have kind of somewhere a middle ground where, you know, kernel does a good job of patrolling their own problems and they are very proactive in things, you know, versus some, you know, a very small project. So you have to think about, there's different criteria, motivations, and resources behind these different levels of things. And I yield over to Yotam now.
Just a quick comment regarding you asked earlier if there may be additional metrics or things that you can look at. So what comes to mind is maybe binary hardening status of the binaries in the system. So basically things like how they are compiled with various flags that enable various exploit mitigation mechanisms such as seccomp, NXBit, ASLR, etc. But that's, I think, a bit more invasive than what you're currently are planning, because there is no such available data set. But I do know that there is variability between the different operating systems and packages in terms of that. But it will require to actually run some code on those, on the image and actually acquire the data.
Right. It's for some of these metrics, we actually do run stuff on the images, but per binary, indeed, that's kind of a challenge to automate. But we'll definitely write it down to see what's possible
We
there.
have there was a tool chain and compare in the code review part.
Let me.
Yeah, the compiler and the tool chain. That's actually we look at a certain compiler, the flags, etc.
Michael links to the Ubuntu security features. I believe that we have it on our documentation list, but I'll write it down nevertheless.
But this one is we look at. Of course, we didn't take all of them, but we look at this is the one page we looked into that when we come up our model. There was actually more than this. So we have this one, and also, for example, like OpenSUSE, Debian. There was a different. Projects also have their security best practice. So when we summarize those details, we look at those communities, look at their practices, and then take those into our model, I say.
Excuse me, Jotam, you have another question?
No, sorry, same hand from before.
Okay, yeah, the Zoom doesn't pull down your hand, it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Notes to say.
So maybe a question to the, let's say the OSSFF team. What is your current, let's say the important thing for you to look at the open source? Is there any parts that, for example, you are looking for, you want to do something, but you find, let's say, needs support, or is there any collaboration opportunities there?
The foundation is very diverse in what we're working on. And so we have 6 working groups, and then we have a set of supported projects. Like Michael mentioned, Alpha and Omega. We have things like SigStore that are projects, not necessarily aligned with the working group. So my feedback overall would be take a look at what working groups are available. And as you are able, come participate. All our meetings are open. All the minutes for each of these groups are available that you could look at and see, oh, well, Critical Projects is talking about something that's really interesting to us with our methodology. So go participate in that community and listen and learn what they're doing and potentially contribute back. We're not patches are always welcome. We're very open sourcey that way. We won't refuse assistance or contributions or feedback. But that's really the main thing, is take a look at the breadth of things. Chaos is another one. So there's a lot going on in the foundation, and we just represent, we have folks that kind of participate in a couple of these groups. But I definitely see some of the work we're doing in best practices would be insightful for you all. A lot of the stuff with the critical projects, kind of learning about how they're going through and what makes up a critical project and how they're engaging with these communities. And then just as an aside, since you seem to be focused on the more commercially side of things, I don't know if you're already engaged with, but we have a lot of connections into those communities and organizations that create those distributions. So if you need assistance in making connections there, we can help, make introductions with members of those different security teams at Fedora, Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu, Canonical, AWS, kind of everywhere. We have these links we can help broker introductions. If you want to talk to how does the OpenSUSE really do this?
Yeah, that would be amazing. It's
Yeah.
and in terms of we didn't mention it, but this R&D that we're doing, we do intend to publish this also. So we're still in the middle of things, but the purpose is that this itself will be disclosed. Of course, without giving any people from any of the distributions a heart attack. So we also have to see like how do we kind of double validate it with people that they are not too shocked. But the intention is that this will be public also at some point.
Yeah, I definitely can broker introductions to the big three. And if you have other communities you're interested in looking at, I probably already also know those folks, but everybody here participates on some level with these different communities. So just shoot me an email and I can help focus that for you and introduce you. And then, if there's communities I'm not aware of, I'll reach out to Jacques or Mr. Scovetta or whomever.
Will do.
I will say one thing. I know I criticized a few points, but I do want to recognize how much work this must represent and how impressive this amount of work is. Well done.
Thank you. And to be honest, the criticism is the best part because otherwise we wouldn't know how to improve it anyway. And at some point you also start to be blind for your own failings. So it's like that, because of course for the teams, this is quite useful to get a prioritized list, but this is very helpful to think about more about the boundaries and limitations of the model.
So Michael has a question. Is your intention to make this methodology, the scoring tools, everything, are you going to open source that, make it publicly available?
To some extent. So it's like whether the whole thing with the thresholds is probably, we need to have a talk about that internally. But the structure and how to measure these things, yes, we want to open source that.
Yeah. We actually also like several dynamic measures. We are also using the open source tool like Linux, etc. So yeah, we are not, let's say, develop every tool by ourselves.
And if you want to talk to the exploit prediction scoring people, I can also make you a connection there. They are actually two of the people helped create CVSS, and it's kind of a counterpoint companion to CVSS, because we all know CVSS isn't risk. It's a description of the vulnerability. All right. With that, I want to thank the SIG team for your time. As you have questions, don't hesitate to pop by any of our working groups. We would thanks, Mike. But feel free to stop by any of the working groups. If you want to have any follow-up conversations, let us know. We're glad to talk.
We
have a
definitely
good rest of your day.
Yeah,
you
thank you. Thank you also. Thank you for all the recommendations. Bye. Have a nice day.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye. Thank you.